This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10. In this series, I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. However, sometimes I like to look at the other end of the spectrum, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at the worst green creatures in Magic. While red and white have green beat when it comes to the smallest creatures, green does generally have the best creatures overall, especially when it comes to raw stats. However, this doesn't mean all green creatures are good. After all, there are 2,402 creatures with a mono green identity, and when there's that many of anything, there's going to be some serious duds. As usual with my worst videos, the cards that appear in it have to meet some important criteria. First, the card has to be bad in all of Magic's main play modes. This means 40 card limited formats, 60 card constructed formats, and 99 card commander. Additionally, the card has to have been bad for the entirety of its existence. In short, for me to consider a card legitimately one of the worst ever, it has to be bad everywhere and for all of Magic's history. Alright, without further ado, let's jump into my picks for the 10 worst green creatures in the history of Magic. At number 10, I've got Deepwood Tantive. For 4 generic and a green, the Tantive is a 2/4 that gains you 2 life when it becomes blocked. To start with, this card has a horrible stat line as a 5 mana 2/4, and then its text box is completely laughable. How often are you going to be attacking with your 2/4, and how often is your opponent going to block it when you do? The answer to both of these is not very often. It would still be bad, but miles better if it gained life when it blocked too. At number 9, it is Lana War Vanguard. This 1/1 costs 2 generic and a green, and it can tap itself to get +0/+4 until end of turn. A 3 mana 1/1 is a horrendous starting point. And even if this was always a 3 mana 1/5, we would be talking about a bad card, but this is really far away from being a 1/5. This is an ability that basically only matters when you're blocking, unless you're going to go to the great effort of giving the Vanguard vigilance or something, but you're really wasting your time if that's what you think you need to do to win a game of Magic. At number 8, it is Hawk-Eater Moth. This one too costs 3 generic and a green, and it comes with both Flying and Shroud. Unlike almost everything on this list, the Moth doesn't die to super cheap removal spells because it has Shroud, but who cares? It's a 4 mana 1/2 with Flying, so the fact it can't be targeted is pretty much irrelevant. And keep in mind this is Shroud and not Hexproof, and that means you can't target it either. So in a lot of ways, that's more downside than upside, because the only way to make this horribly statted creature good is to enhance it, and for the most part, you're just not going to be able to do it. This sees play in a surprising 87 decks over on EDHREC, and I can only imagine that the number is as high as it is because the people who are using it were thinking it has Hexproof and not Shroud. At number 7, it is Ivy Sear. This sports the worst stat line we've seen so far. After all, it's a 1/1 that costs 3 generic and a green. Obviously, it dies to everything as a 1/1, and you don't want to hear that when you're forking over 4 mana. It does have an activated ability, but it's overcosted and highly dependent on the contents of your hand. It does have some upside. If you have a grip of green cards in your hand, it can buff your creatures somewhat impressively, but you just won't have enough cards in your hand for this to ever be efficient, and it isn't even really like it's a legitimate trick, because your opponent knows it's on the board, and they can even make a pretty good guess at how many green cards you have before declaring blockers or attacking. Having to give information to your opponent for this difficult to use ability also doesn't help its case. At number 6, I've got Taoist Mystic. This 2/2 costs 2 generic and a green, and it can't be blocked by creatures with Horsemanship. With a few exceptions, Horsemanship only showed up in a single set, Portal 3 Kingdoms, a set where Horsemanship filled in for Flying and worked pretty much in the same way. A Horsemanship creature can't be blocked by creatures who don't have Horsemanship. So the funny thing here is that even if you modified this to where it couldn't be blocked by flyers instead, it would still be pretty bad because of the bad stat line, and the ability would still not be that impressive. And even in Portal 3 Kingdoms itself, this card wasn't good. So basically this has upside only against a barely used mechanic, and the upside it has isn't very impressive to begin with. At number 5, it is Bognar. This 2/2 costs 4 generic and a green, and it gets +2/+2 when a player casts a black spell. So the idea here is that you could play it in a black-green deck, but even if you cast a black spell every turn, this thing is still only a 5 mana 4/4, so you really need to go off with spells to make this into something that was worth the mana. It does also count the opponent's spells, of course, but it's even harder for you to have control over that because you don't know when they'll cast their black spells, so that isn't exactly a reliable way to buff this. The baseline creature can be killed by many 1-mana removal spells, and the upside is something that requires you to work incredibly hard to even feel like you're getting close to breaking even on your investment. At number 4, it is Groff Skither. This is yet another creature with an absolutely horrible stat line and a really weak text box. For 5 generic and a green, you get a 3/3, and Groff Skither lets you return one of your other Groff Skithers from your graveyard to your hand, but only when it gets blocked. Obviously, this card is at a huge disadvantage in a singleton format like EDH, but it's terrible in non-singleton formats too. This is just an incredibly weak payoff for playing multiples of a 6-mana 3/3 in your deck. I guess the idea is, if you have 1 in your graveyard and your opponent blocks this with an X3, you're going to get a 2-for-1, but a lot of things have to line up right for that to ever be a possibility. For one thing, your opponent will just never block this when the situation would be a trade, and it isn't like that will be hard for them since you're in the later stages of the game when you're playing this 6-drop. That also means the board will usually have multiple creatures that are much larger than Groff Skither. You also have to have another one in the graveyard, which is far from a guarantee itself. This card would be much better if it took a page from a lot of other mediocre collect-em-all type cards, which let you search your library for another copy of themselves, instead of requiring you to have one in your graveyard and requiring your opponent to block for it to give you the value in the first place. In reality, Groff Skither plays like a 6-mana 3/3 with no upside at all, and that is a horrible card. At number 3, it's Viridian Scout. This 1/2 costs 3 generic and a green, and you can pay 2 generic and a green to sacrifice it to do 2 damage to a creature with flying. It has a horrible stat line for the cost and a terrible activated ability. This can kill a very narrow number of flyers for a total investment of 7 mana. The ideal situation for the Scout is that it can kill a flyer with 2 toughness too, so even in the most ideal situation there is for this card, it's terrible. At number 2, it is Shulkin Brownie. The Brownie is a 1/1 that costs 1 generic and a green, and it can tap to remove Bands with Other from another creature until end of turn. Banding is a famously complicated and somewhat underpowered mechanic that allows creatures to attack as a group, and the player who controls the band gets to decide where combat damage goes if they get blocked. The same is true if you block with a creature with banding and at least one other thing it can band with. The crazy thing about the Brownie is that it doesn't stop all banding abilities. It only stops Bands with Other, which is an even weaker and rarer version of banding. The only tournament legal cards that do anything with Bands with Other are the absolutely horrible cycle of lands from Legends that let legendary creatures band with one another. So, Shulkin Brownie hoses something that is even more narrow than what Taoist Mystic does, and it has a horrible stat line to go along with it. And at number 1, it's what else but Wood Elemental. This is one of the more famous worst cards in Magic's history. This star creature costs 3 generic and a green. When it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice any number of untapped forests, and the elemental's power and toughness are each equal to the number of forests sacrificed as it enters the battlefield. Basically, it's an incredibly inefficient creature with a massive downside. If you have 5 forests in play, this ends up being a 4-mana 1/1 that made you sacrifice a forest, and it never really gets efficient. If you have 8 mana, you have a 4-mana 4/4 that makes you sacrifice 4 untapped forests. And sure, there are incentives for sacrificing lands, but there's so many other cards that let you do that in green, that aren't incredibly narrow. I mean, if you want to sack a bunch of lands, just use something like Sylvan Safekeeper or Spitting Spider, which actually do some other stuff. Wood Elemental is one of the worst creatures in all of Magic, and it's an easy pick for the worst green creature in the history of the game. If you want to own any of these cards for some reason, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.